it kind of just keeps getting pushed aside, so I'm just gonna finally sit down and do it here. There's actually a number of very interesting videos already out there talking about flat Earth in connection with the tides, and I think they're all really, really interesting pieces, and I'm not trying to take away actually anything from the ideas being explored in any of those. Flatwater has, I think, at least 2 or 3 on the tides, and he kind of explores the idea of the world breadth. I think it's very interesting way of kind of looking into it. Ashley Webster has a fantastic video talking about the electromagnetic properties of water, and once again, I think that's super interesting connection to all this. And as well, Rich from Mr. Thrive and Survive has talked about the whole electromagnetic thing with the moon and the oceans, and not just tides, but kind of exploring the idea of the currents. And so yeah, I'm not trying to dismiss any of these ideas or refute them at all here. Basically, what I keep coming back to is I think that there's a lot of intriguing possibilities with the whole electromagnetic idea and everything. Obviously, the main thing is looking at the tides in relation to the official model and seeing just how vast of a discrepancy there really is. The whole gravitational model being based not just on the alleged moon's gravitational pull, but the sun and the moon. And so the more I've looked into it, the more peculiar it really gets. Specifically, the thing that I've kind of been fixed on out of all of it is when you look at maps which display the average variations of tides around the world. Here is a flattened out projection, from the globe model here, which is most easily found, and the only place I actually was able to see any type of flat Earth rendering of this same map was on, like I said, Ashley Webster's video on tides and electromagnetic energy, and it's a great video. So thank you, Ashley, for this. I grabbed it off your video, and by the way, Ashley, where you been? You haven't been making any videos lately, so you should get back into that. But I think what's so interesting is that if you just stop and look at this, I don't really think it requires a whole lot of commentary, I wouldn't think, to see why basically on either a globe model or a flat plane, circular plane, why any sort of, obviously the gravitational model, which basically says that the moon's gravitational pull creates a tidal bulge, which basically moves around the Earth, following the moon, even though it doesn't follow it perfectly, and they have all these excuses as to why there's all these variations. But even so, even if you're trying to argue that it's just a tidal bulge that's being interrupted by the continents or the differences in the ocean depths and the currents, and they also say that it's not just the moon's gravitational pull, but the sun's gravitational pull in conjunction with it. It's like, regardless of all these sort of convoluted excuses, all these variables that they throw into the mix to try and make it, explain it away, you just stop and look at this map, and it still doesn't even stand to reason at all according to their explanations, because it really is strange when you just look at it and you see how it doesn't even seem to follow any rhyme or reason in terms of why certain, like the east coast of Africa, the coast of southern Alaska, and the Pacific Northwest of North America, you have the west side of Central America and South America there, and yet on the right on the other side of that isthmus of Panama and Central America, there in the Gulf and the Caribbean, there's hardly any tidal variance at all. And if you think that makes sense, then okay, but that just, to me, that's one of the strangest things. The same thing with the Mediterranean. You look out on the west coast of the western coast of Europe, and you have some of the most extreme tidal variances in the whole Earth, and yet right there in the Mediterranean, it's very little as well. Same thing with New Zealand. On the west side of New Zealand, there's pretty intense tidal variation. On the east side, it's quite negative. I mean, it's just so haphazard. It doesn't follow at all the alleged, what would be the closest point of the Earth, the access point of the Earth to the moon and the moon's orbit. And even on a flat Earth, if you're just looking at it from a electromagnetic kind of concept, an electromagnetic theory to the moon, it doesn't really stand to reason why an electromagnetic field from the moon would create such extreme tidal variations in such seemingly random places. You'd think it would just create a band going around the Earth that maybe if it wasn't an absolute perfect stripe, it would still have to follow. It would still have to more or less follow the moon. Gravitationally speaking, in either the gravitational model or some kind of electromagnetic model. And again, other people have talked about this too, in terms of if it's really just gravity, then why would things like the Great Lakes, or like I said, the Mediterranean, or the Caribbean, why would they seemingly be magically unaffected just because of the depth, the relative shallow depths, or the islands, or it's very strange, because you'll get some places where there's extreme tidal variations where there's no, it's not some narrow inlet, or it's out in basically just an open coastline. And other places where it's very narrow, like the Bay of Fundy, I believe, has one of the most extreme tidal variations in the whole world, and yet it's a bay, so there's really just seems to be no rhyme or reason to it just strictly being connected to the moon. Although I think if there is a connection, it does seem to kind of follow like I said, like the moon can be directly overhead, and then the actual high tide can follow 4 or 5 hours later, or several hours before. And then they attribute this to the rotation of the Earth, and it's like basically the spin of the Earth is kind of pushing the tides, and there's a delay. But even so, it just gets, the more you research this and the more you read about it, the more that even in the official model and the official explanation, they will readily admit that, like from good old Wikipedia here, it says, although the tidal flow period is generally synchronized to the moon's orbit around the Earth, its relative timing varies greatly. In some places on Earth there is only 1 high tide per day, whereas others have 4, though this is somewhat rare. And then you can get into the whole distinction between diurnal tides and semi-diurnal tides, which means a diurnal tide means there's a high tide and a low tide twice a day, right? There's high tide, low tide, basically within a 24-hour period, even though obviously the lunar calendar differs from the solar calendar, so it cycles through, it's offset. But then you have some tides where there's four high tides and 4 low tides. And they say this is rare, but here's a map again showing the differences. So again, look how random it is in terms of the diurnal and semi-diurnal. And there's also some that are combined somehow, that are not exactly one or the other. They're sort of a mishmash of both. And the other thing that I've wondered about too with the electromagnetic theory is why something like the Dead Sea, because the electromagnetic theory attributes the salinity of the oceans as being the reason why they are affected, whereas freshwater is not. Right? Because and there's people have done very simple experiments to show how you increase the salinity of water and it increases its conductivity of electricity. So it's, like I said, it's very interesting, and it seems to be quite, there's definitely validity to at least that part of it. But then why does something like the Dead Sea, which is the saltiest body of water on Earth, shouldn't that have like you would think that that would mean it would have the highest tidal variances anywhere, and yet it's practically non-existent. Obviously it's a sea, it's basically a big salty lake, and it empties into nothing. So I'm sure the official model has an explanation for why that would be. You wouldn't have tides too, but so I know a lot of people say I ramble and don't get to the point, but here is the point that I'm trying to get to. What I'm wondering, and this is just a theory, but I'm just kicking this around, and I've been kicking this around for months now, and I just want to throw it out there and just get feedback on it at this point, because I know it sounds weird, but what I'm wondering about is if there's this other angle that maybe is in conjunction with the electromagnetic factor of the moons, because in certain ways it does seem to be tied to the moon, but in other ways I wonder, specifically in these places where you see the greatest tidal variances, if it's not just like absurd to ponder the idea that those are areas where water is actually coming up from below, and basically gushing out through a vent, or what in the Bible we see described as springs of the deep. And we know from a scriptural point of view such things exist. Whether even if you're trying to stick to a globe model, I don't see how you can really argue that there's not some literal phenomenon having to do with springs of the deep. But from a flat earth perspective, obviously we're looking at this concept of water or the cosmic sea being outside the firmament, and then also underneath the earth itself, and sort of there's depths that go, these depths, and I've talked about this, there's depths that go way down even under the earth perhaps, and I've kind of talked about this a little bit on the Great Flood, Noah's flood, the Great Flood on the flat earth. But still, and so obviously in the flood scenario, they were pretty much opened all the way, and the water came down from the floodgates of the heavens, and it sprang forth from the springs of the deep, and it was like the tap was turned on all the way. But so I guess that's kind of where I'm coming from, trying to consider the possibility of it just being kind of a trickle, but not just a trickle, but in ebb and flow, and in and out, and up and down, and where those places of the most tidal variation, is it possible that those areas are actually closest to where water from underneath is being pushed up and creating that swell, and then it would gradually diffuse out to the ocean around it, and then sink down? I don't know. There's so many questions in a flat Earth cosmology, the water cycle and the water table, and it really is a massive shift in how you have to conceive of all these things, and that applies not just to the oceans, but also freshwater. This concept of freshwater springs and aquifers and things like this. It's just a whole nother avenue I'm interested in exploring, because it's potentially just so vastly different from a globe model, where basically aquifers are more or less regarded as finite resources of fresh water. They're just big caves and pockets filled with fresh water from however long ago. Whereas on an enclosed cosmology, there's really the possibility that these things are just constantly being, it's like there's a constant freshwater source that's coming up through the land. And I know it sounds crazy, but it's kind of fascinating me as well. So just wanted to throw this out there. I'm just throwing this out there as